This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 5. Decision. I ask thee for a thoughtful love, through constant watching wise, to meet the glad with joyful smiles, and to wipe the weeping eyes, and a heart at leisure from itself to soothe and sympathize. Anon. Margaret made a good listener to all her mother's little plans for adding some small comforts to the lot of the poorer parishioners. She could not help listening, though each new project was a stab to her heart. By the time the frost had set in, they should be far away from Helston. Old Simon's rheumatism might be bad, and his eyesight worse. There would be no one to go and read to him, and comfort him with little porringers of broth and good red flannel. Or if there was, it would be a stranger, and the old man would watch in vain for her. Mary Domville's little crippled boy would crawl in vain to the door and look for her coming through the forest. These poor friends would never understand why she had forsaken them, and there were many others besides. Papa has always spent the income he derived from his living in the parish. I am perhaps encroaching upon the next dues, but the winter is likely to be severe, and our poor old people must be helped. "Oh, mamma, let us do all we can," said Margaret eagerly, not seeing the prudential side of the question, only grasping at the idea that they were rendering such help for the last time. "We may not be here long." "Do you feel ill, my darling?" asked Mrs. Hale anxiously, misunderstanding Margaret's hint of the uncertainty of their stay at Helston. "You look pale and tired. It is this soft, damp, unhealthy air." "No, no, mamma, it is not that. It is delicious air. It smells of the freshest, purest fragrance after the smokiness of Harley Street. But I am tired. It surely must be near bedtime." "Not far off. It is 9:30. You had better go to bed at once, dear. Ask Dixon for some gruel. I will come in and see you as soon as you are in bed. I am afraid you have taken cold, or this bad air from one of the stagnant ponds." "Oh, mamma," said Margaret, faintly smiling as she kissed her mother, "I am quite well. Don't alarm yourself about me. I am only tired." Margaret went upstairs. To soothe her mother's anxiety, she submitted to a basin of gruel. She was lying languidly in bed when Mrs. Hale came in to make some last inquiries and kiss her before going to her own room for the night. But the instant she heard her mother's door locked, she sprang out of bed, and throwing her dressing gown on, she began to pace up and down the room until the creaking of one of the boards reminded her that she must make no noise. She went and curled herself up on the window seat in the small, deeply recessed window. That morning, when she had looked out, her heart had danced at seeing the bright, clear lights on the church tower, which foretold a fine and sunny day. This evening, 16 hours at most had passed by. She sat down, too full of sorrow to cry, but with a dull, cold pain which seemed to have pressed the youth and buoyancy out of her heart, never to return. Mr. Henry Lennox's visit, his offer, was like a dream, a thing beside her actual life. The hard reality was that her father had so admitted tempting doubts into his mind as to become a schismatic, an outcast. All the changes subsequent upon this grouped themselves around that one great, blighting fact. She looked out upon the dark grey lines of the church tower, square and straight in the centre of the view, cutting against the deep blue transparent depths beyond, into which she gazed, and felt that she might gaze for ever, seeing at every moment some farther distance, and yet no sign of God. It seemed to her, at the moment, as if the earth was more utterly desolate than if girt in by an iron dome, beyond which there might be the ineffaceable peace and glory of the Almighty. Those never-ending depths of space in their still serenity were more mocking to her than any material bounds could be, shutting in the cries of earth's sufferers, which now might ascend into that infinite splendour of vastness and be lost, lost for ever, before they reached his throne. In this mood, her father came in unheard. The moonlight was strong enough to let him see his daughter in her unusual place and attitude. He came to her and touched her shoulder before she was aware that he was there. "Margaret, I heard you were up. I could not help coming in to ask you to pray with me, to say the Lord's Prayer. That will do good to both of us." Mr. Hale and Margaret knelt by the window-seat, he looking up, she bowed down in humble shame. God was there, close around them, hearing her father's whispered words. Her father might be a heretic, but had not she, in her despairing doubts not 5 minutes before, shown herself a far more utter sceptic? She spoke not a word, but stole to bed after her father had left her, like a child ashamed of its fault. If the world was full of perplexing problems, she would trust, and only ask to see one step needful for the hour. Mr. Lennox, his visit, his proposal, the remembrance of which had been so rudely pushed aside by the subsequent events of the day, haunted her dreams that night. He was climbing up some tree of fabulous height to reach the branch whereon was slung her bonnet. He was falling, and she was struggling to save him, but held back by some invisible, powerful hand. He was dead. And yet, with a shifting of the scene, she was once more in the Harley Street drawing-room, talking to him as of old, and still with a consciousness all the time that she had seen him killed by that terrible fall. Miserable, unresting night! Ill preparation for the coming day! She awoke with a start, unrefreshed, and conscious of some reality worse even than her feverish dreams. It all came back upon her. Not merely the sorrow, but the terrible discord in the sorrow. Where, to what distance apart, had her father wandered, led by doubts which were to her temptations of the evil one? She longed to ask, and yet would not have heard for all the world. The fine, crisp morning made her mother feel particularly well and happy at breakfast time. She talked on, planning village kindnesses, unheeding the silence of her husband and the monosyllabic answers of Margaret. Before the things were cleared away, Mr. Hale got up. He leaned one hand on the table, as if to support himself. "I shall not be home till evening. I am going to Bracy Common, and will ask Farmer Dobson to give me something for dinner. I shall be back to tea at 7. He did not look at either of them, but Margaret knew what he meant. By 7 the announcement must be made to her mother. Mr. Hale would have delayed making it till 6:30, but Margaret was of different stuff. She could not bear the impending weight on her mind all the day long. Better get the worst over. The day would be too short to comfort her mother. But while she stood by the window, thinking how to begin, and waiting for the servant to have left the room, her mother had gone upstairs to put on her things to go to the school. She came down, ready equipped, in a brisker mood than usual. "Mother, come round to the garden with me this morning, just one turn," said Margaret, putting her arm around Mrs. Hale's waist. They passed through the open window. Mrs. Hale spoke, said something, Margaret could not tell what. Her eye caught on a bee entering a deep-belled flower. When that bee flew forth with his spoils, she would begin. That should be the sign. Out he came. "Mamma, Papa is going to leave Helston," she blurted forth. "He is going to leave the church and live in Milton Northern." There were the 3 hard facts, hardly spoken. "What makes you say so?" asked Mrs. Hale in a surprised, incredulous voice. "Who has been telling you such nonsense?" "Papa himself," said Margaret, longing to say something gentle and consoling, but literally not knowing how. They were close to a garden bench. Mrs. Hale sat down and began to cry. "I don't understand you," she said. "Either you have made some great mistake, or I don't quite understand you." "No, mother, I have made no mistake. Papa has written to the bishop saying that he has such doubts that he cannot conscientiously remain a priest of the Church of England, and that he must give up Helston. He has also consulted Mr. Bell, Friedrich's godfather, you know, mamma, and it is arranged that we go to live in Milton Northern." Mrs. Hale looked up in Margaret's face all the time she was speaking these words. The shadow on her countenance told that she at least believed in the truth of what she said. "I don't think it can be true," said Mrs. Hale at length. "He would surely have told me before it came to this." It came strongly upon Margaret's mind that her mother ought to have been told. That whatever her faults of discontent and repining might have been, it was an error in her father to have left her to learn his change of opinion and his approaching change of life from her better informed child. Margaret sat down by her mother and took her unresisting head on her breast, bending her own soft cheeks down caressingly to touch her face. "Dear darling mamma, we were so afraid of giving you pain. Papa felt so acutely. You know you are not strong, and there must have been such terrible suspense to go through." "When did he tell you, Margaret?" "Yesterday. Only yesterday," replied Margaret, detecting the jealousy which prompted the inquiry. "Poor papa!" Trying to divert her mother's thoughts into compassionate sympathy for all her father had gone through, Mrs. Hale raised her head. "What does he mean by having doubts?" she asked. "Surely he does not mean that he thinks differently? That he knows better than the Church?" Margaret shook her head, and the tears came into her eyes as her mother touched the bare nerve of her own regret. "Can't the bishop set him right?" asked Mrs. Hale, half impatiently. "I am afraid not," said Margaret. "But I did not ask. I could not bear to hear what he might answer. It is all settled, at any rate. He is going to leave Helston in a fortnight. I am not sure if he did not say he had sent in his deed of resignation." "In a fortnight!" exclaimed Mrs. Hale. "I do think this is very strange. Not at all right. I call it very unfeeling," said she, beginning to take relief in tears. "He has doubts, you say, and gives up his living, and all without consulting me. I dare say if he had told me his doubts at the first, I could have nipped them in the bud." Mistaken as Margaret felt her father's conduct to have been, she could not bear to hear it blamed by her mother. She knew that his very reserve had originated in a tenderness for her, which might be cowardly, but was not unfeeling. "I almost hoped you might have been glad to leave Helston, mamma," said she after a pause. "You have never been well in this air, you know." "You can't think the smoking air of a manufacturing town, all chimneys and dirt like Milton Northern, would be better than this air, which is pure and sweet, if it is so soft and relaxing. Fancy living in the middle of factories and factory people! Though, of course, if your father leaves the Church, we shall not be admitted into society anywhere. It will be such a disgrace to us. Poor dear Sir John! It is well he is not alive to see what your father has come to. Every day after dinner, when I was a girl living with your Aunt Shaw at Beresford Court, Sir John used to give for the first toast, Church and King, and down with the rump." Margaret was glad that her mother's thoughts were turned away from the fact of her husband's silence to her on the point which must have been so near his heart. Next to the serious, vital anxiety as to the nature of her father's doubts, this was the one circumstance of the case that gave Margaret the most pain. "You know we have very little society here, mamma. The Gormans, who are our nearest neighbours to call society, and we hardly ever see them, have been in trade just as much as these Milton Northern people." "Yes," said Mrs. Hale almost indignantly. "But, at any rate, the Gormans made carriages for half the gentry of the county, and were brought into some kind of intercourse with them. But these factory people, who on earth wears cotton that can afford linen?" "Well, mamma, I give up the cotton spinners. I am not standing up for them any more than for any other tradespeople. Only we shall have little enough to do with them." "Why on earth has your father fixed on Milton Northern to live in?" "Partly," said Margaret, sighing, "because it is so very different from Helston. Partly because Mr. Bell says there is an opening there for a private tutor." "Private tutor in Milton? Why can't he go to Oxford and be a tutor to gentlemen?" "You forget, mamma. He is leaving the Church on account of his opinions. His doubts would do him no good at Oxford." Mrs. Hale was silent for some time, quietly crying. At last she said, "And the furniture? How in the world are we to manage the removal? I never removed in my life, and only a fortnight to think about it." Margaret was inexpressibly relieved to find that her mother's anxiety and distress was lowered to this point, so insignificant to herself, and on which she could do so much to help. She planned and promised, and led her mother on to arrange fully as much as could be fixed before they knew somewhat more definitively what Mr. Hale intended to do. Throughout the day, Margaret never left her mother, bending her whole soul to sympathize in all the various turns of her feelings. Towards evening, especially, as she became more and more anxious that her father should find a soothing welcome awaiting him after his return from his day of fatigue and distress, she dwelt upon what he must have borne in secret for long. Her mother only replied coldly that he ought to have told her, and that then, at any rate, he would have had an adviser to give him counsel. And Margaret turned faint at heart when she heard her father's step in the hall. She dared not go to meet him and tell him what she had done all day, for fear of her mother's jealous annoyance. She heard him linger, as if waiting for her, or some sign of her, and she dared not stir. She saw by her mother's twitching lips and changing colour that she too was aware that her husband had returned. Presently he opened the room door and stood there, uncertain whether to come in. His face was grey and pale. He had a timid, fearful look in his eyes, something almost pitiful to see in a man's face. But that look of despondent uncertainty, of mental and bodily languor, touched his wife's heart. She went to him and threw herself on his breast, crying out, "Oh, Richard, Richard, you ought to have told me sooner!" And then, in tears, Margaret left her, as she rushed upstairs to throw herself on her bed and hide her face in the pillows, to stifle the hysteric sobs that would force their way at last, after the rigid self-control of the whole day. How long she lay thus, she could not tell. She heard no noise, though the housemaid came in to arrange the room. The affrighted girl stole out again on tiptoe and went and told Mrs. Dixon that Miss Hale was crying as if her heart would break. She was sure she would make herself deadly ill if she went on at that rate. In consequence of this, Margaret felt herself touched, and started up into a sitting posture. She saw the accustomed room, the figure of Dixon in shadow, as the latter stood holding the candle a little behind her for fear of the effect on Miss Hale's startled eyes, swollen and blinded as they were. "Oh, Dixon, I did not hear you come into the room," said Margaret, resuming her trembling self-restraint. "Is it very late?" continued she, lifting herself languidly off the bed, yet letting her feet touch the ground without fairly standing down, as she shaded her wet, ruffled hair off her face, and tried to look as though nothing were the matter, as if she had only been asleep. "I hardly can tell what time it is," replied Dixon in an aggrieved tone of voice. "Since your mamma told me this terrible news when I dressed her for tea, I have lost all count of time. I am sure I don't know what is to become of us all. When Charlotte told me just now that you were sobbing, Miss Hale, I thought no wonder, poor thing. And master thinking of turning dissenter at his time of life, when, if it is not to be said he's done well in the church, he's not done badly after all. I had a cousin, miss, who turned Methodist preacher after he was 50 years of age and a tailor all his life. But then he had never been able to make a pair of trousers to fit for as long as he had been in the trade, so it was no wonder. But for master, as I said to missus, what would poor Sir John have said? He never liked your marrying Mr. Hale, but if he could have known what it would have come to this, he would have sworn worse oaths than ever, if that was possible." Dixon had been so much accustomed to comment upon Mr. Hale's proceedings to her mistress, who listened to her or not as she was in humour, that she never noticed Margaret's flashing eye and dilating nostril. To hear her father talked of in this way by a servant to her face! "Dixon," she said in the low tone she always used when much excited, which had a sound in it as of some distant turmoil or threatening storm breaking far away. "Dixon, you forget to whom you are speaking." She stood upright and firm on her feet now, confronting the waiting maid and fixing her with her steady, discerning eye. "I am Mr. Hale's daughter. Go. You have made a strange mistake, and one that I am sure your own good feeling will make you sorry for when you think about it." Dixon hung irresolutely about the room for a minute or two. Margaret repeated, "You may leave me, Dixon. I wish you to go." Dixon did not know whether to resent these decided words or to cry. Either course would have done with her mistress, but, as she said to herself, "Miss Margaret has a touch of the old gentleman about her, as well as poor Master Frederick. I wonder where they get it from." And she, who would have resented such words from anyone less haughty and determined in manner, was subdued enough to say, in a half humble, half injured tone, "Mayn't I unfasten your gown, miss, and do your hair?" "No, not tonight, thank you." And Margaret gravely lighted her out of the room and bolted the door. From henceforth Dixon obeyed and admired Margaret. She said it was because she was so like poor Master Frederick, but the truth was that Dixon, as do many others, liked to feel herself ruled by a powerful and decided nature. Margaret needed all Dixon's help in action and silence in words, for some time the latter thought it her duty to show her sense of affront by saying as little as possible to her young lady, so the energy came out in doing rather than in speaking. A fortnight was a very short time to make arrangements for so serious removal. As Dixon said, anyone but a gentleman, indeed almost any other gentleman... But catching a look at Margaret's straight, stern brow just here, she coughed the remainder of the sentence away, and meekly took the horehound drop that Margaret offered her to stop the "little tickling in me chest, miss." But almost anyone but Mr. Hale would have had practical knowledge enough to see that in so short a time it would be difficult to fix on any house in Milton Northern, or indeed elsewhere, to which they could remove the furniture that had of necessity to be taken out of Helston Vicarage. Mrs. Hale, overpowered by all the troubles and necessities for immediate household decisions that seemed to come upon her at once, became really ill, and Margaret almost felt it as a relief when her mother fairly took to her bed and left the management of affairs to her. Dixon, true to her post of bodyguard, attended most faithfully to her mistress, and only emerged from Mrs. Hale's bedroom to shake her head and murmur to herself in a manner which Margaret did not choose to hear. For the one thing clear and straight before her was the necessity for leaving Helston. Mr. Hale's successor in the living was appointed, and, at any rate, after her father's decision there must be no lingering now, for his sake as well as from every other consideration. For he came home every evening more and more depressed after the necessary leave-taking which he had resolved to have with every individual parishioner. Margaret, inexperienced as she was in all the necessary matter-of-fact business to be got through, did not know to whom to apply for advice. The cook and Charlotte worked away with willing arms and stout hearts at all the moving and packing, and, as far as that went, Margaret's admirable sense enabled her to see what was best, and to direct how it should be done. But where were they to go? In a week they must be gone. Straight to Milton, or where? So many arrangements depended upon this decision that Margaret resolved to ask her father one evening, in spite of his evident fatigue and low spirits. He answered, "My dear, I have really had too much to think about to settle this. What does your mother say? What does she wish, poor Maria?" He met with an echo even louder than his sigh. Dixon had just come into the room for another cup of tea for Mrs. Hale, and, catching Mr. Hale's last words, and protected by his presence from Margaret's upbraiding eyes, made bold to say, "My poor mistress!" "You don't think her worse today?" said Mr. Hale, turning hastily. "I am sure I can't say, sir. It is not for me to judge. The illness seems so much more on the mind than on the body." Mr. Hale looked infinitely distressed. "You had better take mamma her tea while it is hot, Dixon," said Margaret in a tone of quiet authority. "Oh, I beg your pardon, miss. My thoughts was otherwise occupied in thinking of my of Mrs. Hale." "Papa," said Margaret, "it is the suspense that is bad for you both. Of course, mamma must feel your change of opinions. We can't help that," she continued softly. "But now the course is clear, at least, to a certain point. And I think, papa, that I could get mamma to help me in planning, if you could tell me what to plan for. She has never expressed any wish in any way, and only thinks of what can't be helped. Are we to go straight to Milton? Have you taken a house there?" "No," he replied. "I suppose we must go into lodgings and look about for a house." "And pack up the furniture so that it can be left at the railway station till we have met with one?" "I suppose so. Do what you think best. Only remember, we shall have much less money to spend." They had never had much superfluity, as Margaret knew. She felt that it was a great weight suddenly thrown upon her shoulders. 4 months ago, all the decisions she needed to make were what dress she would wear for dinner, and to help Edith to draw out the lists of who should take down whom in the dinner parties at home. Nor was the household in which she lived one that called for much decision. Except in the one grand case of Captain Lennox's offer, everything went on with the regularity of clockwork. Once a year there was a long discussion between her aunt and Edith as to whether they should go to the Isle of Wight, abroad, or to Scotland. But at such times Margaret herself was secure of drifting, without any exertion of her own, into the quiet harbour of home. Now, since that day when Mr. Lennox came and startled her into a decision, every day brought some question momentous to her and to those whom she loved, to be settled. Her father went up after tea to sit with his wife. Margaret remained alone in the drawing-room. Suddenly she took a candle and went into her father's study for a great atlas, and, lugging it back into the drawing-room, she began to pore over the map of England. She was ready to look up brightly when her father came downstairs. "I have hit upon such a beautiful plan. Look here. In Berkshire, hardly the breadth of my finger from Milton, is Heaston, which I have often heard of from people living in the north as such a pleasant little bathing place. Now, don't you think we could get mamma there with Dixon while you and I go and look for houses, and get one all ready for her in Milton? She would get a breath of sea air to set her up for the winter, and be spared all the fatigue. And Dixon would enjoy taking care of her." "Is Dixon to go with us?" asked Mr. Hale in a kind of helpless dismay. "Oh, yes," said Margaret. "Dixon quite intends it. And I don't know what mamma would do without her." "But we shall have to put up with a very different way of living, I am afraid. Everything is so much dearer in a town. I doubt if Dixon can make herself comfortable. To tell you the truth, Margaret, I sometimes feel as if that woman gave herself airs." "To be sure she does, papa," replied Margaret. "And if she has to put up with a different style of living, we shall have to put up with her airs, which will be worse. But she really loves us all, and would be miserable to leave us, I am sure, especially in this change. So, for mamma's sake, and for the sake of her faithfulness, I do think she must go." "Very well, my dear. Go on. I am resigned. How far is Heaston from Milton? The breadth of one of your fingers does not give me a very clear idea of distance." "Well, then, I suppose it is 30 miles. That is not much." "Not in distance, but in... Never mind. If you really think it will do your mother good, let it be fixed so." This was a great step. Now Margaret could work and act and plan in good earnest, and now Mrs. Hale could rouse herself from her languor and forget her real suffering in thinking of the pleasure and the delight of going to the seaside. Her only regret was that Mr. Hale could not be with her all the fortnight she was to be there, as he had been for a whole fortnight once, when they were engaged and she was staying with Sir John and Lady Beresford at Torquay. End of chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 6. Farewell. Unwatched, the garden boughs shall sway, the tender blossoms flutter down. Unloved, that beech will gather brown, the maple burn itself away. Unloved, the sunflower, shining fair, ray round with flames her disk of seed, and many a rose carnation feed with summer spice the humming air, till from the garden and the wild a fresh association blow, and year by year the landscape grow familiar to the strangest child. As year by year the labourer tills his wonted glebe or lops the glades, and year by year our memory fades from all the circle of the hills. Tennyson. The last day came. The house was full of packing cases, which were being carted off at the front door to the nearest railway station. Even the pretty lawn at the side of the house was made unsightly and untidy by the straw that had been wafted upon it through the open door and windows. The rooms had a strange echoing sound in them, and the light came harshly and strongly in through the uncurtained windows, seeming already unfamiliar and strange. Mrs. Hale's dressing-room was left untouched to the last, and there she and Dixon were packing up clothes and interrupting each other every now and then to exclaim at and turn over with fond regard some forgotten treasure in the shape of some relic of the children while they were yet little. They did not make much progress with their work. Downstairs Margaret stood calm and collected, ready to counsel or advise the men who had been called in to help the cook and Charlotte. These two last, crying between whiles, wondered how the young lady could keep up so this last day, and settled it between them that she was not likely to care much for Helston, having been so long in London. There she stood, very pale and quiet, with her large grey eyes observing everything, up to every present circumstance, however small. They could not understand how her heart was aching all the time with a heavy pressure that no sighs could lift off or relieve, and how constant exertion of her perceptive faculties was the only way to keep herself from crying out with pain. Moreover, if she gave herself away, who was to act? Her father was examining papers, books, registers, what not, in the vestry with the clerk, and when he came in, there were his own books to pack up, which no one but himself could do to his satisfaction. Besides, was Margaret one to give way before strange men, or even household friends like the cook and Charlotte? Not she. But at last the four Packers went into the kitchen to their tea, and Margaret moved stiffly and slowly away from the place in the hall where she had been standing so long, out through the bare echoing drawing-room, into the twilight of the early November evening. There was a filmy veil of soft, dull mist, obscuring but not hiding all objects, giving them a lilac hue, for the sun had not yet fully set. A robin was singing. Perhaps, Margaret thought, the very robin that her father had so often talked of as his winter pet, and for which he had made, with his own hands, a kind of robin-house by his study window. The leaves were more gorgeous than ever. The first touch of frost would lay them all low on the ground. Already one or two kept constantly floating down, amber and golden in the low, slanting sun-rays. Margaret went along the walk under the pear-tree wall. She had never been along it since she paced it at Henry Lennox's side. Here, at this bed of time, he began to speak of what she must not think of now. Her eyes were on that late blowing rose as she was trying to answer, and she had caught the idea of the vivid beauty of the feathery leaves of the carrots in the very middle of his last sentence. Only a fortnight ago, and all so changed. Where was he now? In London, going through the old round, dining with the old Harley Street set, or with the gayer young friends of his own? Even now, while she walked sadly through that damp, drear garden in the dusk, with everything falling and fading and turning to decay around her, he might be gladly putting away his law-books after a day of satisfactory toil, and freshening himself up, as he had told her he often did, by a run in the Temple Gardens, taking in the while the grand, inarticulate, mighty roar of tens of thousands of busy men, nigh at hand, but not seen, and catching ever, at his quick turns, glimpses of the lights of the city coming up out of the depths of the river. He had often spoken to Margaret of these hasty walks, snatched in the intervals between study and dinner. At his best times, and in his best moods, had he spoken of them, and the thought of them had struck upon her fancy. Here there was no sound. The robin had gone away into the vast stillness of night. Now and then a cottage door in the distance was opened and shut, as if to admit the tired labourer to his home, but that sounded very far away. A stealthy, creeping, crunching sound among the crisp fallen leaves of the forest, beyond the garden, seemed almost close at hand. Margaret knew it was some poacher. Sitting up in her bedroom this past autumn with the light of her candle extinguished, and purely revelling in the solemn beauty of the heavens and the earth, she had many a time seen the light, noiseless leap of the poachers over the garden fence, their quick tramp across the dewy moonlit lawn, their disappearances in the black, still shadow beyond. The wild, adventurous freedom of their life had taken her fancy. She felt inclined to wish them success. She had no fear of them. But tonight she was afraid. She knew not why. She heard Charlotte shutting the windows and fastening up for the night, unconscious that anyone had gone out into the garden. A small branch, it might be of rotten wood, or it might be broken by force, came heavily down in the nearest part of the forest. Margaret ran, swift as Camilla, down to the window and rapped at it with a hurried tremulousness which startled Charlotte within. "Let me in! Let me in! It is only me, Charlotte!" Her heart did not still its fluttering till she was safe in the drawing-room with the windows fastened and bolted and the familiar walls hemming her round and shutting her in. She sat upon a packing-case, cheerless. Chill was the dreary and dismantled room. No fire nor other light but Charlotte's long unsnuffed candle. Charlotte looked at Margaret with surprise, and Margaret, feeling it rather than seeing it, rose up. "I was afraid you were shutting me out altogether, Charlotte," said she, half smiling, "and then you would never have heard me in the kitchen, and the doors into the lane and churchyard are locked long ago." "Oh, miss, I should have been sure to have missed you soon. The men would have wanted you to tell them how to go on, and I have put tea in master's study, as being the most comfortable room, so to speak." "Thank you, Charlotte. You are a kind girl. I shall be sorry to leave you. You must try and write to me. If I can ever give you any little help or good advice, I shall always be glad to get a letter from Helston, you know. I shall be sure to send you my address when I know it." The study was all ready for tea. There was a good blazing fire and unlighted candles on the table. Margaret sat down on the rug, partly to warm herself, for the dampness of the evening hung about her dress, and over-fatigue had made her chilly. She kept herself balanced by clasping her hands together around her knees, her head dropped a little towards her chest. The attitude was one of despondency, whatever her frame of mind might be. But when she heard her father's step on the gravel outside, she started up, and hastily shaking her heavy black hair back, and wiping a few tears away that had come on her cheeks, she knew not how, she went out to open the door for him. He showed far more depression than she did. She could hardly get him to talk, although she tried to speak on subjects that would interest him, at the cost of an effort every time, which she thought would be her last. "Have you been a very long walk today?" asked she, on seeing his refusal to touch food of any kind. "As far as Fordham Beeches. I went to see Widow Maltby. She is sadly grieved at not having wished you good-bye. She says little Susan has kept watch down the lane for you for days past." "Nay, Margaret, what is the matter, dear?" The thought of the little child watching for her, and continually disappointed, from no forgetfulness on her part, but from sheer inability to leave home, was the last drop in poor Margaret's cup, and she was sobbing away as if her heart would break. Mr. Hale was distressingly perplexed. He rose and walked nervously up and down the room. Margaret tried to check herself, but would not speak until she could do so with firmness. She heard him talking as if to himself. "I cannot bear it. I cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. I think I could go through my own with patience. Oh, is there no going back?" "No, father," said Margaret, looking straight at him, and speaking low and steadily. "It is bad to believe you in error. It would be infinitely worse to have known you a hypocrite." She dropped her voice at the last few words, as if entertaining the idea of hypocrisy for a moment in connection with her father savoured of irreverence. "Besides," she went on, "it is only that I am tired tonight. I don't think that I am suffering from what you have done. Dear papa, we can't either of us talk about it tonight. I believe," said she, finding that tears and sobs would come in spite of herself, "I had better go and take mamma up this cup of tea. She had hers very early when I was too busy to go to her, and I am sure she will be glad of another now." Railroad time inexorably wrenched them away from lovely beloved Helston the next morning. They were gone. They had seen the last of the long, low parsonage home, half covered with China roses and pyrasanthus, more homelike than ever in the morning sun that glittered on its windows, each belonging to some well-loved room. Almost before they had settled themselves into the car sent from Southampton to fetch them to the station, they were gone away to return no more. A sting at Margaret's heart made her strive to look out to catch the last glimpse of the old church tower at the turn where she knew it might be seen above a wave of the forest trees. But her father remembered this too, and she silently acknowledged his greater right to the one window from which it could be seen. She leant back and shut her eyes, and the tears welled forth and hung glittering for an instant on the shadowing eyelashes before rolling slowly down her cheeks and dropping unheeded on her dress. They were to stop in London all night at some quiet hotel. Poor Mrs. Hale had cried in her way nearly all day long, and Dixon showed her sorrow by extreme crossness and a continual irritable attempt to keep her petticoats from even touching the unconscious Mr. Hale, whom she regarded as the origin of all this suffering. They went through the well-known streets, past houses which they had often visited, past shops in which she had lounged impatient by her aunt's side while that lady was making some important and interminable discussion, nay, absolutely past acquaintances in the streets, for though the morning had been of an incalculable length to them, and they felt as if it ought long ago to have closed in for the repose of darkness, it was the very busiest time of a London afternoon in November when they arrived there. It was long since Mrs. Hale had been in London, and she roused up, almost like a child, to look about her at the different streets, and to gaze after and exclaim at the shops and carriages. "Oh, there's Harrison's, where I bought so many of my wedding things. Dear, how altered! They've got immense plate-glass windows, larger than Crawford's in Southampton. Oh, and there, I declare! No, it is not. Yes, it is. Margaret, we have just passed Mr. Henry Lennox. Where can he be going among all these shops?" Margaret started forwards, and as quickly fell back, half smiling at herself for the sudden motion. They were 100 yards away by this time, but he seemed like a relic of Helston. He was associated with a bright morning and eventful day, and she should have liked to have seen him without his seeing her, without the chance of their speaking. The evening, without employment, passed in a room high up in a hotel, was long and heavy. Mr. Hale went out to his bookseller's and to call on a friend or two. Everyone they saw, either in the house or out in the streets, appeared hurrying to some appointment, expected by or expecting somebody. They alone seemed strange and friendless and desolate. Yet within a mile Margaret knew of house after house where she, for her own sake, and her mother for her Aunt Shaw's, would be welcomed, if they came in gladness, or even in peace of mind. If they came sorrowing and wanting sympathy in a complicated trouble like the present, then they would be felt as a shadow in all these houses of intimate acquaintances, not friends. London life is too whirling and full to admit of even an hour of that deep silence of feeling which the friends of Job showed when they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 7. New Scenes and Faces. Mist clogs the sunshine. Smoky dwarf houses have we round on every side. Matthew Arnold. The next afternoon, about 20 miles from Milton Northern, they entered on the little branch railway that led to Easton. Easton itself was one long straggling street, running parallel to the seashore. It had a character of its own, as different from the little bathing places in the south of England as they again from those of the Continent. To use a Scotch word, everything looked more purpose-like. The county cars had more iron and less wood and leather about the horse-gear. The people in the streets, although on pleasure bent, had yet a busy mind. The colours looked greyer, more enduring, not so gay and pretty. There were no smock frocks, even among the country folk. They retarded motion and were apt to catch on machinery, and so the habit of wearing them had died out. In such towns in the south of England, Margaret had seen the shopmen, when not employed in their business, lounging a little at their doors, enjoying the fresh air and the look up and down the street. Here, if they had any leisure from customers, they made themselves business in the shop, even, Margaret fancied, to the unnecessary rolling and re-rolling of ribbons. All these differences struck upon her mind as she and her mother went out next morning to look for lodgings. Their 2 nights at hotels had cost more than Mr. Hale had anticipated, and they were glad to take the first clean, cheerful rooms they met with that were at liberty to receive them. There, for the first time for many days, did Margaret feel at rest. There was a dreaminess in the rest, too, which made it still more perfect and luxurious to repose in. The distant sea, lapping the sandy shore with measured sound, the nearer cries of the donkey boys, the unusual scenes moving before her like pictures which she cared not, in her laziness, to have fully explained before they passed away. The stroll down to the beach to breathe the sea air, soft and warm on that sandy shore, even to the end of November, the great, long, misty sea-line touching the tender-coloured sky, the white sail of a distant boat turning silver in some pale sunbeam. It seemed as if she could dream her life away in such luxury of pensiveness, in which she made her present all in all, from not daring to think of the past, or wishing to contemplate the future. But the future must be met, however stern and iron it be. One evening it was arranged that Margaret and her father should go the next day to Milton Northern and look out for a house. Mr. Hale had received several letters from Mr. Bell, and 1 or 2 from Mr. Thornton, and he was anxious to ascertain at once a good many particulars respecting his position and chances of success there, which he could only do by an interview with the latter gentleman. Margaret knew that they ought to be removing, but she had a repugnance to the idea of a manufacturing town, and believed that her mother was receiving benefit from the Easton air, so she would willingly have deferred the expedition to Milton. For several miles before they reached Milton, they saw a deep, lead-coloured cloud hanging over the horizon in the direction in which it lay. It was all the darker for the contrast with the pale grey blue of the wintry sky, for in Easton there had been the earliest signs of frost. Nearer to the town, the air had a faint taste and smell of smoke. Perhaps, after all, more a loss of the fragrance of grass and herbage than any positive taste or smell. Quick, they were whirled over long, straight, hopeless streets of regularly built houses, all small and of brick. Here and there a great oblong, many-windowed factory stood up, like a hen among her chickens, puffing out black, unparliamentary smoke, and sufficiently accounting for the cloud which Margaret had taken to foretell rain. As they drove through the larger and wider streets from the station to the hotel, they had to stop constantly. Great loaded lorries blocked up the not over-wide thoroughfares. Margaret had now and then been into the city in her drives with her aunt, but the heavy lumbering vehicles seemed various in their purposes and intent. Here, every van, every wagon and truck bore cotton, either in the raw shape, in bags, or the woven shape, in bales of calico. People thronged the footpaths, most of them well dressed as regarded the material, but with a slovenly looseness which struck Margaret as different from the shabby, threadbare smartness of a similar class in London. "New Street," said Mr. Hale. "This, I believe, is the principal street in Milton. Bell has often spoken to me about it. It was the opening of this street from a lane into a great thoroughfare 30 years ago, which has caused his property to rise so much in value. Mr. Thornton's mill must be somewhere not very far off. He is Mr. Bell's tenant, but I fancy he dates from his warehouse." "Where is our hotel, papa?" "Close to the end of this street, I believe. Shall we have lunched before or after we have looked for the houses we marked in the Milton Times?" "Oh, let us get our work done first." "Very well. Then I will only see if there is a note or a letter for me from Mr. Thornton, who said he would let me know anything he might hear about these houses, and then we will set off. We will keep the cab. It will be safer than losing ourselves and being too late for the train this afternoon." There were no letters awaiting him. They set out on their house hunting. £30 a year was all they could afford to give, but in Hampshire they could have met with a roomy house and pleasant garden for the money. Here, even the necessary accommodation of 2 sitting rooms and 4 bedrooms seemed unattainable. They went through their list, rejecting each as they visited it, and then they looked at each other in dismay. "We must go back to the second, I think. That one in Cramton, don't they call the suburb? There were 3 sitting rooms. Don't you remember how we laughed at the number compared with the 3 bedrooms? But I have planned it all. The front room downstairs is to be your study and our dining room, poor papa. For, you know, we settled mamma's to have as cheerful a sitting room as we can get. And the front room upstairs, with the atrocious blue and pink paper and heavy cornice, had really a pretty view over the plain, with a great bend of river or canal or whatever it is down below. And then I could have the little bedroom behind, in that projection at the head of the first flight of stairs, over the kitchen, you know. And you and mamma, the room behind the drawing room, and that closet in the roof will make you a splendid dressing room." "But Dixon and the girl we are to have to help?" "Oh, wait a minute. I am overpowered by the discovery of my own genius for management. Dixon is to have... let me see, I had it once. The back sitting room. I think she will like that. She grumbles so much about the stairs at Heaston. And the girl is to have that sloping attic over your room and mamma's. Won't that do?" "I dare say it will. But the papers. What taste! And the overloading such a house with colour and such heavy cornices." "Never mind, papa. Surely you can charm the landlord into repapering 1 or 2 of the rooms? The drawing room and your bedroom, for mamma will come most into contact with them. And your bookshelves will hide a great deal of that gaudy pattern in the dining room." "Then you think it best? If so, I had better go at once and call on this Mr. Donkin, to whom the advertisement refers me. I will take you back to the hotel, where you can order lunch and rest, and by the time it is ready I shall be with you. I hope I shall be able to get new papers." Margaret hoped so too, though she said nothing. She had never come fairly in contact with the taste that loves ornament, however bad, more than the plainness and simplicity which are of themselves the framework of elegance. Her father took her through the entrance of the hotel, and leaving her at the foot of the staircase, went to the address of the landlord of the house they had fixed upon. Just as Margaret had her hand on the door of their sitting room, she was followed by a quick-stepping waiter. "I beg your pardon, ma'am. The gentleman was gone so quickly I had no time to tell him. Mr. Thornton called almost directly after you left, and as I understood from what the gentleman said you would be back in an hour, I told him so, and he came again about 5 minutes ago and said he would wait for Mr. Hale. He's in your room now, miss." "Thank you. My father will return soon, and then you can tell him." Margaret opened the door and went in with that straight, fearless, dignified presence habitual to her. She felt no awkwardness. She had too much the habits of society for that. Here was a person come on business to her father, and as he was one who had shown himself obliging, she was disposed to treat him with a full measure of civility. Mr. Thornton was a good deal more surprised and discomfited than she. Instead of a quiet, middle-aged clergyman, a young lady came forward with frank dignity, a young lady of a very different type to most of those he was in habit of seeing. Her dress was very plain. A close straw bonnet of the best material and shape, trimmed with white ribbon, a dark silk gown without any trimming or flounce, a large Indian shawl which hung about her in long, heavy folds, and which she wore as an empress wears her drapery. He did not understand who she was, as he caught the simple, straight, unabashed look, which showed that his being there was of no concern to the beautiful countenance, and called up no flush of surprise to the pale ivory of the complexion. He had heard that Mr. Hale had a daughter, but he had imagined that she was a little girl. "Mr. Thornton, I believe," said Margaret, after half an instant's pause, during which his unready words would not come. "Will you sit down? My father brought me to the door not a minute ago, but unfortunately he was not told that you were here, and he has gone away on some business. But he will come back almost directly. I am sorry you have had the trouble of calling twice." Mr. Thornton was in habits of authority himself, but she seemed to assume some kind of rule over him at once. He had been getting impatient at the loss of his time on a market day, the moment before she appeared, yet now he calmly took a seat at her bidding. "Do you know where it is that Mr. Hale has gone to? Perhaps I might be able to find him." "He has gone to a Mr. Duncan's in Cannot Street. He is the landlord of the house my father wishes to take in Cramton." Mr. Thornton knew the house. He had seen the advertisement, and been to look at it in compliance with a request of Mr. Bell's that he would assist Mr. Hale to the best of his power, and also instigated by his own interest in the case of a clergyman who had given up his living under circumstances such as Mr. Hale. Mr. Thornton had thought the house in Crampton was really just the thing, but now that he saw Margaret, with her superb ways of moving and looking, he began to feel ashamed of having imagined that it would do very well for the Hales, in spite of a certain vulgarity in it which had struck him at the time of his looking it over. Margaret could not help her looks, but the short, curled upper lip, the round, massive, upturned chin, the manner of carrying her head, her movements full of a soft, feminine defiance, always gave strangers the impression of haughtiness. She was tired now, and would rather have remained silent and taken the rest her father had planned for her. But, of course, she owed it to herself to be a gentlewoman, and to speak courteously from time to time to this stranger, not overbrushed nor overpolished, it must be confessed, after his rough encounter with Milton streets and crowds. She wished that he would go, as he had once spoken of doing, instead of sitting there answering with curt sentences all the remarks she made. She had taken off her shawl and hung it over the back of her chair. She sat facing him and facing the light. Her full beauty met his eye, her round, white, flexile throat rising out of the full yet lithe figure, her lips moving so slightly as she spoke, not breaking the cold, serene look of her face with any variation from the one lovely, haughty curve. Her eyes, with their soft gloom, meeting his with quiet maiden freedom. He almost said to himself that he did not like her, before their conversation ended. He tried so to compensate himself for the mortified feeling that while he looked upon her with an admiration he could not repress, she looked at him with proud indifference, taking him, he thought, for what in his irritation he told himself he was, a great rough fellow with not a grace or a refinement about him. Her quiet coldness of demeanour he interpreted into contemptuousness, and resented it in his heart to the pitch of almost inclining him to get up and go away and have nothing more to do with these Hales and their superciliousness. Just as Margaret had exhausted her last subject of conversation, and yet conversation that could hardly be called which consisted of so few and such short speeches, her father came in, and with his pleasant, gentlemanly courteousness of apology, reinstated his name in Thornton's good opinion. Mr. Hale and his visitor had a good deal to say respecting their mutual friend, Mr. Bell, and Margaret, glad that her part of entertaining the visitor was over, went to the window to try and make herself more familiar with the strange aspect of the street. She got so much absorbed in watching what was going on outside that she hardly heard her father when he spoke to her, and he had to repeat what he said. "Margaret, the landlord will persist in admiring that hideous paper, and I'm afraid we must let it remain." "Oh dear, I am sorry," she replied, and began to turn over in her mind the possibility of hiding part of it, at least, by some of her sketches, but gave up the idea at last as likely only to make bad worse. Her father, meanwhile, with his kindly country hospitality, was pressing Mr. Thornton to stay to luncheon with them. It would have been very inconvenient to him to do so, yet he felt that he should have yielded, if Margaret by word or look had seconded her father's invitation. He was glad she did not, and yet he was irritated at her for not doing it. She gave him a low, grave bow when he left, and he felt more awkward and self-conscious in every limb than he had ever done in all his life before. "Well, Margaret, now to luncheon, as fast as we can. Have you ordered it?" "No, papa. That man was here when I came home, and I had never had opportunity." "Then we must take anything we can get. He must have been waiting a long time, I am afraid." "It seemed exceedingly long to me. I was just at the last gasp when you came in. He never went on with any subject, but gave little, short, abrupt answers." "Very much to the point, though, I should think. He's a clear-headed fellow. He said, did you hear, that Cramton is on gravelly soil, and by far the most healthy suburb in the neighbourhood of Milton." When they returned to Heaston, there was the day's account to be given to Mrs. Hale, who was full of questions which they answered in the intervals of tea-drinking. "And what is your correspondent, Mr. Thornton, like?" "Ask Margaret," said her husband. "She and he had a long attempt at conversation while I was away speaking to the landlord." "Oh, I hardly know what he is like," said Margaret lazily, too tired to tax her powers of description much. And then, rousing herself, she said, "He is a tall, broad-shouldered man, about— How old, papa?" "I should guess about 30. "About 30. With a face that is neither exactly plain nor yet handsome. Nothing remarkable. Not quite a gentleman, but that was hardly to be expected." "Not vulgar or common, though," put in her father, rather jealous of any disparagement of the sole friend he had in Milton. "Oh, no," said Margaret, with such an expression of resolution and power, no face, however plain in feature, could be either vulgar or common. "I should not like to have to bargain with him. He looks very inflexible. Altogether a man who seems made for his niche, mamma. Sagacious and strong, as becomes a great tradesman." "Don't call the Milton manufacturers tradesmen, Margaret," said her father. "They are very different." "Are they? I apply the word to all who have something tangible to sell. But if you think the term is not correct, papa, I won't use it. But, oh, mamma, speaking of vulgarity and commonness, you must prepare yourself for our drawing-room paper. Pink and blue roses with yellow leaves, and such a heavy cornice around the room." But when they removed to their new house in Milton, the obnoxious papers were gone. The landlord received their thanks very composedly, and let them think, if they liked, that he had relented from his expressed determination not to repaper. There was no particular need to tell them that what he did not care to do for a Reverend Mr. Hale, unknown in Milton, he was only too glad to do at the one short, sharp remonstrance of Mr. Thornton, the wealthy manufacturer. End of chapter 7.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Megan Olson in Waxhaw, North Carolina, September 2007. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 8. Homesickness. And it's home, 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 home fain would I be. It needed the pretty light papering of the rooms to reconcile them to Milton. It needed more that could not be had. The thick yellow November fogs had come on, and the view of the plain in the valley, made by the sweeping bend of the river, was all shut out when Mrs. Hale arrived at her new home. Margaret and Dixon had been at work for 2 days, unpacking and arranging, but everything inside the house still looked in disorder, and outside a thick fog crept up to the very windows and was driven in to every open door in choking white wreaths of unwholesome mist. "Oh, Margaret, are we to live here?" asked Mrs. Hale in blank dismay. Margaret's heart echoed the dreariness of the tone in which this question was put. She could scarcely command herself enough to say, "Oh, the fogs in London are sometimes far worse." "But then you knew that London itself and friends lay behind it. Here, well, we are desolate. Oh, Dixon, what a place this is!" "Indeed, ma'am, I'm sure it will be your death before long, and then I know who'll stay. Miss Hale, that's far too heavy for you to lift." "Not at all, thank you, Dixon," replied Margaret coldly. "The best thing we can do for mamma is to get her room quite ready for her to go to bed, while I go and bring her a cup of coffee." Mr. Hale was equally out of spirits, and equally came upon Margaret for sympathy.
"Margaret, I do believe this is an unhealthy place. Only suppose that your mother's health or yours should suffer. I wish I had gone into some country place in Wales. This is really terrible," said he, going up to the window. There was no comfort to be given. They were settled in Milton, and must endure smoke and fogs for a season. Indeed, all other life seemed shut out from them by as thick a fog of circumstance. Only the day before, Mr. Hale had been reckoning up with dismay how much their removal and fortnight at Heaston had cost, and he had found it had absorbed nearly all his little stock of ready money. No, here they were, and here they must remain. At night, when Margaret realized this, she felt inclined to sit down in a stupor of despair. The heavy, smoky air hung about her bedroom, which occupied the long, narrow projection at the back of the house. The window, placed at the side of the oblong, looked to the blank wall of a similar projection, not above 10 feet distant. It loomed through the fog like a great barrier to hope. Inside the room, everything was in confusion. All their efforts had been directed to make her mother's room comfortable. Margaret sat down on a box, the direction card upon which struck her as having been written at Helston. Beautiful, beloved Helston! She lost herself in dismal thought. But at last she determined to take her mind away from the present, and suddenly remembered that she had a letter from Edith, which she had only half read in the bustle of the morning. It was to tell of their arrival at Corfu, their voyage along the Mediterranean, their music and dancing on board ship, the gay new life opening before her, her house with its trellised balcony, and its views over white cliffs and deep blue sea. Edith wrote fluently and well, if not graphically. She could not only seize the salient and characteristic points of a scene, but she could enumerate enough of indiscriminate particulars for Margaret to make it out for herself. Captain Lennox and another lately married officer shared a villa, high up on the beautiful precipitous rocks overhanging the sea. Their days, late as it was in the year, seemed spent in boating or land picnics, all out of doors. Pleasure-seeking and glad, Edith's life seemed like the deep vault of blue sky above her. Free, utterly free, from fleck or cloud. Her husband had to attend drill, and she, the most musical officer's wife there, had to copy the new and popular tunes out of the most recent English music, for the benefit of the bandmaster. Those seemed their most severe and arduous duties. She expressed an affectionate hope that, if the regiment stopped another year at Corfu, Margaret might come and pay her a long visit. She asked Margaret if she remembered the day, 12th, on which she, Edith, wrote, how it rained all day long in Harley Street, and how she would not put on her new gown to go to a stupid dinner, and get it all wet and splashed in going to the carriage, and how, at that very dinner, they had first met Captain Lennox. Yes, Margaret remembered it well. Edith and Mrs. Shaw had gone to dinner. Margaret had joined the company in the evening. The recollection of the plentiful luxury of all the arrangements, the stately handsomeness of the furniture, the size of the house, the peaceful, untroubled ease of the visitors, all came vividly before her, in strange contrast to the present time. The smooth sea of that old life closed up, without a mark left to tell where they had all been. The habitual dinners, the calls, the shopping, the dancing evenings were all going on for ever.
though her Aunt Shaw and Edith were no longer there, and she, of course, was even less missed. She doubted if any one of that old set ever thought of her, except Henry Lennox. He, too, she knew, would strive to forget her, because of the pain she had caused him. She had heard him often boast of his power of putting any disagreeable thought far away from him. Then she penetrated farther into what might have been. If she had cared for him as a lover, and had accepted him, and this change in her father's opinions and consequent station had taken place, she could not doubt but that it would have been impatiently received by Mr. Lennox. It was a bitter mortification to her in one sense, but she could bear it patiently, because she knew her father's purity of purpose, and that strengthened her to endure his errors, grave and serious though in her estimation they were. But the fact of the world esteeming her father degraded, in its rough wholesale judgment, would have oppressed and irritated Mr. Lennox. As she realized what might have been, she grew to be thankful for what was. They were at the lowest now. They could not be worse. Edith's astonishment and her Aunt Shaw's dismay would have to be met bravely when their letters came. So Margaret rose up and began slowly to undress herself, feeling the full luxury of acting leisurely, late as it was, after all the past hurry of the day. She fell asleep, hoping for some brightness, either internal or external. But if she had known how long it would be before the brightness came, her heart would have sunk low down. The time of the year was most unpropitious to health, as well as to spirits. Her mother caught a severe cold, and Dixon herself was evidently not well, although Margaret could not insult her more than by trying to save her, or by taking any care of her. They could hear of no girl to assist her. All were at work in the factories. At least, those who applied were well scolded by Dixon for thinking that such as they could ever be trusted to work in a gentleman's house. So they had to keep a charwoman in almost constant employ. Margaret longed to send for Charlotte, but besides the objection of her being the better servant than they could now afford to keep, the distance was too great. Mr. Hale met with several pupils, recommended to him by Mr. Bell, or by the more immediate influence of Mr. Thornton. They were mostly of the age when many boys would still be at school, but, according to the prevalent and apparently well-founded notions of Milton, to make a lad into a good tradesman, he must be caught young, and acclimated to the life of the mill, or office, or warehouse. If he were sent to even the Scotch universities, he came back unsettled for commercial pursuits. How much more so if he went to Oxford or Cambridge, where he could not be entered till he was 18? So most of the manufacturers placed their sons in sucking situations, at 14 or 15 years of age, unsparingly cutting away all offshoots in the direction of literature or high mental cultivation, in hopes of throwing the whole strength and vigour of the plant into commerce. Still, there were some wiser parents, and some young men, who had sense enough to perceive their own deficiencies, and strive to remedy them. Nay, there were a few no longer youths, but men in the prime of life, who had the stern wisdom to acknowledge their own ignorance, and to learn late what they should have learnt early. Mr. Thornton was perhaps the oldest of Mr. Hale's pupils. He was certainly the favourite. Mr. Hale got into the habit of quoting his opinions so frequently, and with such regard, that it became a little domestic joke to wonder what time, during the hour appointed for instruction, could be given to absolute learning. So much of it appeared to have been spent in conversation. Margaret rather encouraged this light, merry way of viewing her father's acquaintance with Mr. Thornton, because she felt that her mother was inclined to look upon this new friendship of her husband's with jealous eyes. As long as his time had been solely occupied with his books and his parishioners, as at Helston, she had appeared to care little whether she saw much of him or not. But now that he looked eagerly forward to each renewal of his intercourse with Mr. Thornton, she seemed hurt and annoyed, as if he were slighting her companionship for the first time. Mr. Hale's overpraise had the usual effect of overpraise upon his auditors. They were a little inclined to rebel against Aristide's always being called the just. After a quiet life in a country parsonage for more than 20 years, there was something dazzling to Mr. Hale in the energy which conquered immense difficulties with ease. The power of the machinery of Milton, the power of the men of Milton, impressed him with a sense of grandeur, which he yielded to without caring to inquire into the details of its exercise. But Margaret went less abroad, among machinery and men, saw less of power in its public effect, and, as it happened, she was thrown in with one or two of those who, in all measures of affecting masses of people, must be acute sufferers for the good of many. The question always is, has everything been done to make the sufferings of these exceptions as small as possible? Or, in the triumph of the crowded procession, have the helpless been trampled on, instead of being gently lifted aside out of the roadway of the conqueror, whom they have no power to accompany on his march? It fell to Margaret's share to have to look out for a servant to assist Dickson, who had at first undertaken to find just the person she wanted to do all the rough work of the house. But Dickson's ideas of helpful girls were founded on the recollection of tidy elder scholars at Helston School, who were only too proud to be allowed to come to the parsonage on a busy day, and treated Mrs. Dickson with all the respect, and a good deal more of fright, which they paid to Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Dickson was not unconscious of this odd reverence which was given to her, nor did she dislike it. It flattered her much as Louis XIV was flattered by his courtiers shading their eyes from the dazzling light of his presence. But nothing short of her faithful love for Mrs. Hale could have made her endure the rough, independent way in which all the Milton girls who made application for the servant's place replied to her inquiries respecting their qualifications. They even went the length of questioning her back again, having doubts and fears of their own as to the solvency of a family who lived in a house of £30 a year, and yet gave themselves airs, and kept 2 servants, one of them so very high and mighty. Mr. Hale was no longer looked upon as vicar of Helston, but as a man who only spent at a certain rate. Margaret was weary and impatient of the accounts which Dickson perpetually brought to Mrs. Hale of the behaviour of these would-be servants. Not but what Margaret was repelled by the rough, uncourteous manners of these people, not but what she shrunk with fastidious pride from their hail-fellow accost, and severely resented their unconcealed curiosity as to the means and position of any family who lived in Milton, and yet were not engaged in trade of some kind. But the more Margaret felt impertinence, the more likely she was to be silent on the subject. And, at any rate, if she took upon herself to make inquiry for a servant, she could spare her mother the recital of all her disappointments and fancied or real insults. Margaret accordingly went up and down to butchers and grocers, seeking for a nonpareil of a girl, and lowering her hopes and expectations every week, as she found the difficulty of meeting with anyone in a manufacturing town who did not prefer the better wages and greater independence of working in a mill. It was something of a trial to Margaret to go out by herself in this busy, bustling place. Mrs. Shaw's ideas of propriety and her own helpless dependence on others had always made her insist that a footman should accompany Edith and Margaret in Harley Street or the immediate neighbourhood. The limits by which this rule of her aunt's had circumscribed Margaret's independence had been silently rebelled against at the time, and she had doubly enjoyed the free walks and rambles of her forest life, from the contrast which they presented. She went along there with a bounding, fearless step that occasionally broke out into a run, if she were in a hurry, and occasionally was stilled into perfect repose as she stood listening to or watching any of the wild creatures who sang in the leafy courts, or gazed out with their keen bright eyes from the narrow brushwood or tangled furze. It was a trial to come down from such motion or such stillness, only guided by her own sweet will, to the even and decorous pace necessary in the streets. But she could have laughed at herself for minding this change, if it had not been accompanied by what was a more serious annoyance. The side of town on which Cramton lay was especially a thoroughfare for the factory people. In the back streets around them there were many mills, out of which poured streams of men and women 2 or 3 times a day. Until Margaret had learnt the times of their ingress and egress, she was very unfortunate in constantly falling in with them. They came rushing along with bold, fearless faces, and loud laughs and jests, particularly aimed at all those who appeared to be above them in rank or station. The tones of their unrestrained voices and their carelessness of all common rules of street politeness frightened Margaret a little at first. The girls, with their rough but not unfriendly freedom, would comment on her dress, even touch her shawl or gown to ascertain the exact material. Nay, once or twice she was asked questions relative to some article which they particularly admired. There was such a simple reliance on her womanly sympathy with their love of dress, and on her kindliness, that she gladly replied to these inquiries as soon as she understood them, and half smiled back at their remarks. She did not mind meeting any number of girls, loud-spoken and boisterous though they might be. But she alternately dreaded and fired up against the workmen, who commented not on her dress, but on her looks, in the same open, fearless manner. She, who had hitherto felt that even the most refined remark on her personal appearance was an impertinence, had to endure undisguised admiration from these outspoken men. But the very outspokenness marked their innocence of any intention to hurt her delicacy, as she would have perceived if she had been less frightened by the disorderly tumult. Out of her fright came a flash of indignation, which made her face scarlet, and her eyes gather flame, as she heard some of their speeches. Yet there were other sayings of theirs, which, when she reached the quiet safety of her home, amused her, even while they irritated her. For instance, one day, after she had passed a number of men, several of whom had paid her the not unusual compliment of wishing she were their sweetheart, one of the lingerers added, "Your bonny face, my lass, makes the day look brighter." And another day, as she was unconsciously smiling at some passing thought, she was addressed by a poorly dressed, middle-aged workman with, "You may well smile, my lass. Many a one would smile to have such a bonny face." This man looked so careworn that Margaret could not help giving him an answering smile, glad to think that her looks, such as they were, should have had the power to call up a pleasant thought. He seemed to understand her acknowledging glance, and a silent recognition was established between them whenever the chance of the day brought them across each other's paths. They had never exchanged a word. Nothing had been said but that first compliment. Yet somehow Margaret looked upon this man with more interest than upon anyone else in Milton. Once or twice, on Sundays, she saw him walking with a girl, evidently his daughter, and, if possible, still more unhealthy than he was himself. One day Margaret and her father had been as far as the fields that lay around the town. It was early spring, and she had gathered some of the hedge and ditch flowers, dog violets and lesser celandines, and the like, with an unspoken lament in her heart for the sweet profusion of the south. Her father had left her to go into Milton upon some business, and on the road home she met her humble friends. The girl looked wistfully at the flowers, and, acting on a sudden impulse, Margaret offered them to her. Her pale blue eyes lightened up as she took them, and her father spoke for her. "Thank you, miss. Bessie, you'll think a deal o' them flowers, that oo will.
and I shall think a deal o' your kindness. You're not of this country, I reckon?"
"No," said Margaret, half sighing. "I come from the south. From Hampshire," she continued, a little afraid of wounding his consciousness of ignorance if she used a name which he did not understand.
"That's beyond London, I reckon. And I come from Burnley ways, and 40 mile to the north. And yet, you see, north and south has both met and made a kind of friends in this big smoky place."
Margaret had slackened her pace to walk alongside of the man and his daughter, whose steps were regulated by the feebleness of the latter. She now spoke to the girl, and there was a sound of tender pity in the tone of her voice as she did so that went right to the heart of the father. "I am afraid you are not very strong." "No," said the girl. "No, never will be." "Spring is coming," said Margaret, as if to suggest pleasant, hopeful thoughts. "Spring nor summer will do me good," said the girl quietly. Margaret looked up at the man, almost expecting some contradiction from him, or at least some remark that would modify his daughter's utter hopelessness. But instead he added, "I'm afeard who speaks truth. I'm afeard who's too far gone in a waste." "I shall have a spring where I'm bound to, and flowers and amaranths, and shining robes besides."
"Ah, poor lass," said her father in a low tone. "I'm none so sure o' that. But it's a comfort to thee, poor lass, poor lass. Poor father, it'll be soon."
Margaret was shocked by his words. Shocked, but not repelled. Rather attracted and interested. "Where do you live? I think we must be neighbours. We meet so often on the road."
"We put up at 9 Francis Street. Second turn to the left, after you've passed the Golden Dragon."
"And your name? I must not forget that."
"I'm none ashamed o' my name. It's Nicholas Higgins, who's called Bessie Higgins. What'n you asking for?"
Margaret was surprised at this last question, for at Helston it would have been an understood thing, after the inquiries she had made, that she intended to come and call upon any poor neighbour whose name and habitation she had asked for. I meant to come and see you." She suddenly felt rather shy of offering the visit, without having any reason to give for her wish to make it, beyond a kindly interest in a stranger. It seemed all at once to take the shape of an impertinence on her part. She read this meaning, too, in the man's eyes.
"I'm none so fond of having strange folk in my house." But then, relenting, as he saw her heightened colour, he added, "You're a foreigner, as one may say, and maybe don't know many folks here, and you've given my wench here flowers out of your own hand. You may come if you like."
Margaret was half amused, half nettled at this answer. She was not sure if she would go where permission was given so like a favour conferred. But when they came to the town into Francis Street, the girl stopped a minute and said, "You'll not forget you're to come and see us?"
"Aye, aye," said the father, impatiently. "Who'll come? Who's a bit set up now because who thinks I might have spoken more civilly. But who'll think better on it, and come. I can read her proud, bonny face like a book. Come along, Bess. There's the mill bell ringing."
Margaret went home, wondering at her new friends, and smiling at the man's insight into what had been passing in her mind. From that day Milton became a brighter place to her. It was not the long, bleak, sunny days of spring, nor yet was it that time was reconciling her to the town of her habitation. It was that in it she had found a human interest. End of chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Megan Olson, in Waxhaw, North Carolina, September 2007. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 9. Dressing for Tea. Let China's earth, enriched with coloured stains, pencilled with gold, and streaked with azured veins, the grateful flavour of the Indian leaf, or Mocho's sunburnt berry, glad receive. Mrs. Barbauld. The day after this meeting with Higgins and his daughter, Mr. Hale came upstairs into the little drawing-room at an unusual hour. He went up to different objects in the room, as if examining them, but Margaret saw that it was merely a nervous trick, a way of putting off something he wished, yet feared to say. Out it came at last.
"My dear, I've asked Mr. Thornton to come to tea tonight."
Mrs. Hale was leaning back in her easy-chair, with her eyes shut, and an expression of pain on her face, which had become habitual to her of late. But she roused up into querulousness at this speech of her husband's.
"Mr. Thornton? And tonight? What in the world does the man want to come here for? And Dixon is washing my muslins and laces, and there is no soft water with these horrid east winds, which I suppose we shall have all the year round in Milton." "The wind is veering round, my dear," said Mr. Hale, looking out at the smoke, which drifted right from the east, only he did not yet understand the points of the compass, and rather arranged them ad libitum, according to circumstances.
"Don't tell me," said Mrs. Hale, shuddering up, and wrapping her shawl about her still more closely.
"But east or west wind, I suppose this man comes."
"Oh, mamma, that shows you never saw Mr. Thornton. He looks like a person who would enjoy battling with every adverse thing he could meet with, enemies, winds, or circumstances. The more it rains and blows, the more certain we are to have him. But I'll go and help Dixon. I'm getting to be a famous clear-starcher, and he won't want any amusement beyond talking to papa. Papa, I am really longing to see the Pythias to your Damon. You know I never saw him but once, and then we were so puzzled to know what to say to each other that we did not get on particularly well."
"I don't know that you ever would like him or think him agreeable, Margaret. He is not a ladies' man." Margaret wreathed her throat in a scornful curve.
"I don't particularly admire ladies' men, papa. But Mr. Thornton comes here as your friend, as one who has appreciated you."
"The only person in Milton," said Mrs. Hale.
"So we will give him a welcome, and some coconut cakes. Dixon will be flattered if we ask her to make some, and I will undertake to iron your caps, mamma." Many a time that morning did Margaret wish Mr. Thornton far enough away. She had planned other employments for herself, a letter to Edith, a good piece of Dante, a visit to the Higginses. But instead she ironed away, listening to Dixon's complaints, and only hoping that by an excess of sympathy she might prevent her from carrying the recital of her sorrows to Mrs. Hale. Every now and then Margaret had to remind herself of her father's regard for Mr. Thornton, to subdue the irritation of weariness that was stealing over her, and bringing on one of the bad headaches to which she had lately become liable. She could hardly speak when she sat down at last, and told her mother that she was no longer Peggy the laundry-maid, but Margaret Hale, the lady. She meant this speech for a little joke, and was vexed enough with her busy tongue when she found her mother taking it seriously.
"Yes, if anyone had told me when I was Miss Beresford, and one of the belles of the country, that a child of mine would have to stand half a day in a little poky kitchen, working away like a servant, that we might prepare properly for the reception of a tradesman, and that this tradesman should be the only—"
"Oh, mamma," said Margaret, lifting herself up, "don't punish me so for a careless speech. I don't mind ironing, or any kind of work, for you and papa. I am myself a born and bred lady through it all, even though it comes to scouring a floor, or washing dishes. I am tired now, just for a little while, but in half an hour I shall be ready to do the same over again. And as to Mr. Thornton's being in trade, Why, he can't help that now. Poor fellow. I don't suppose his education would fit him for much else." Margaret lifted herself slowly up, and went to her own room, for just now she could not bear much more. In Mr. Thornton's house, at this very same time, a similar yet different scene was going on. A large-boned lady, long past middle age, sat at work in a grim, handsomely furnished dining-room. Her features, like her frame, were strong and massive, rather than heavy. Her face moved slowly from one decided expression to another, equally decided. There was no great variety in her countenance, but those who looked at it once generally looked at it again. Even the passers-by in the street half turned their heads to gaze an instant longer at the firm, severe, dignified woman, who never gave way in street courtesy, or paused in her straight onward course to the clearly defined end which she proposed to herself. She was handsomely dressed in stout black silk, of which not a thread was worn or discoloured. She was mending a large, long tablecloth of the finest texture, holding it up against the light occasionally to discover thin places which required her delicate care. There was not a book about in the room, with the exception of Matthew Henry's Bible commentaries, 6 volumes of which lay in the centre of the massive sideboard, flanked by a tea-urn on one side and a lamp on the other. In some remote apartment there was exercise upon the piano going on. Someone was practising up a Mercure de Salon, playing it very rapidly, every third note, on an average, being either indistinct or wholly missed out, and the loud chords at the end being half of them false, but not the less satisfactory to the performer. Mrs. Thornton heard a step, like her own, in its decisive character, pass the dining-room. "John, is that you?" Her son opened the door and showed himself. "What has brought you home so early? I thought you were going to tea with that friend of Mr. Bell's." "That Mr. Hale?" "So I am, mother. I am come home to dress." "Dress? Humph! When I was a girl, young men was satisfied with dressing once in a day. Why should you go and dress to take a cup of tea with an old parson?" "Mr. Hale is a gentleman, and his wife and daughter are ladies." "Wife and daughter? Do they teach too? What do they do? You have never mentioned them." "No, mother, because I have never seen Mrs. Hale, and I have only seen Miss Hale for half an hour." "Take care you don't get caught by a penniless girl, John." "I am not easily caught, mother, as I think you know. But I must not have Miss Hale spoken of in that way, which, you know, is offensive to me. I never was aware of any young lady trying to catch me yet, nor do I believe that anyone has ever given themselves that useless trouble." Mrs. Thornton did not choose to yield the point to her son, or else she had, in general, pride enough for her sex. "Well, I only say take care. Perhaps our Milton girls have too much spirit and good feeling to go angling after husbands. But this Miss Hale comes out of the aristocratic countries, where, if at all tales be true, rich husbands are reckoned prizes." Mr. Thornton's brow contracted, and he came a step forward into the room. "Mother," with a short, scornful laugh, "you will make me confess. The only time I saw Miss Hale, she treated me with a haughty civility, which had a strong flavour of contempt in it. She held herself aloof from me as if she had been a queen, and I, her humble, unwashed vassal. Be easy, mother." "No, I am not easy, nor content either. What business had she, a renegade clergyman's daughter, to turn up her nose at you? I would dress for none of them, a saucy set, if I were you." As he was leaving the room, he said, "Mr. Hale is a good and gentle and learned man. He is not saucy. As for Mrs. Hale, I will tell you what she is like tonight, if you care to hear." He shut the door and was gone. Despise my son. Treat him as her vassal, indeed. Humph! I should like to know where she could find such another. Boy and man,
He's the noblest, stoutest heart I ever knew. I don't care if I'm his mother. I can see what's what, and not be blind. I know what Fanny is, and I know what John is. Despise him. I hate her.
End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Megan Olson, in Waxhaw, North Carolina, September 2007. North and South by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 10. Wrought Iron and Gold. We are the trees, whom shaking fastens more. George Herbert. Mr. Thornton left the house without coming into the dining-room again. He was rather late, and walked rapidly out to Cramton. He was anxious not to slight his new friend by any disrespectful unpunctuality. The church clock struck 7:30 as he stood at the door awaiting Dixon's slow movements, always doubly slow when she had to degrade herself by answering the door-bell. He was ushered into the little drawing-room, and kindly greeted by Mr. Hale, who led him up to his wife, whose pale face and shawl-draped figure made a silent excuse for the cold languor of her greeting. Margaret was lighting the lamp when he entered, for the darkness was coming on. The lamp threw a pretty light into the centre of the dusky room, from which, with country habits, they did not exclude the night skies, and the outer darkness of air. Somehow, that room contrasted itself with the one he had lately left, handsome, ponderous, with no sign of feminine habitation, except in the one spot where his mother sat, and no convenience for any other employment than eating and drinking. To be sure, it was a dining-room. His mother preferred to sit in it, and her will was a household law. But the drawing-room was not like this. It was 20 times as fine, not 1/4 as comfortable. Here were no mirrors, not even a scrap of glass to reflect the light, and answer the same purpose as water in a landscape. No gilding, a warm, sober breadth of colouring, well relieved by the dear old Helston chintz curtains and chair-covers. An open davenport stood in the window opposite the door, from which drooped wreaths of English ivy, pale green birch, and copper-coloured beech leaves. Pretty baskets of work stood about in different places, and books, not cared for on account of their binding solely, lay on one table, as if recently put down. Behind the door was another table, decked out for tea, with a white tablecloth, on which flourished the cocoanut cakes, and a basket piled with oranges and ruddy American apples, heaped on leaves. It appeared to Mr. Thornton that all these graceful cares were habitual to the family, and especially of a piece with Margaret. She stood by the table in a light-coloured muslin gown, which had a good deal of pink about it. She looked as if she was not attending to the conversation, but solely busy with the teacups, among which her round ivory hands moved with pretty, noiseless daintiness. She had a bracelet on one taper arm, which would fall down over her round wrist. Mr. Thornton watched the replacing of this troublesome ornament with far more attention than he listened to her father. It seemed as if it fascinated him to see her push it up impatiently until it tightened her soft flesh, and then to mark the loosening, the fall. He could almost have exclaimed, "There it goes again!" There was so little left to be done after he arrived at the preparation for tea that he was almost sorry, for the obligation of eating and drinking came so soon to prevent his watching Margaret. She handed him his cup of tea with the proud air of an unwilling slave, but her eye caught the moment when he was ready for another cup, and he almost longed to ask her to do for him what he saw her compelled to do for her father, who took her little finger and thumb in his masculine hand and made them serve as sugar-tongs. Mr. Thornton saw her beautiful eyes lifted to her father, full of light, half laughter and half love, as this bit of pantomime went on between the two, unobserved, as they fancied, by any. Margaret's head still ached, as the paleness of her complexion and her silence might have testified, but she was resolved to throw herself into the breach, if there was any long untoward pause, rather than that her father's friend, pupil, and guest should have cause to think himself in any way neglected. But the conversation went on, and Margaret drew into a corner, near her mother, with her work, after the tea-things were taken away, and felt that she might let her thoughts roam without fear of being suddenly wanted to fill up a gap. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Hale were both absorbed in the continuation of some subject which had been started at their last meeting. Margaret was recalled to a sense of the present by some trivial, low-spoken remark of her mother's, and on suddenly looking up from her work, her eye was caught by the differences of outward appearance between her father and Mr. Thornton, as betokening such distinctly opposite natures. Her father was of a slight figure, which made him appear taller than he really was, when not contrasted, as at this time, with the tall, massive frame of another. The lines in her father's face were soft and waving, with a frequent undulating kind of trembling movement passing over them, showing every fluctuating emotion. The eyelids were large and arched, giving to the eyes a peculiar, languid beauty, which was almost feminine. The brows were finely arched, but were, by the very size of the dreamy lids, raised to a considerable distance from the eyes. Now, in Mr. Thornton's face, the straight brows fell low over the clear, deep-set, earnest eyes, which, without being unpleasantly sharp, seemed intent enough to penetrate into the very heart and core of what he was looking at. The lines in the face were few but firm, as if they were carved in marble, and lay principally about the lips, which were slightly compressed over a set of teeth so faultless and beautiful as to give the effect of sudden sunlight when the rare bright smile, coming in an instant and shining out of the eyes, changed the whole look from the severe and resolved expression of a man ready to do and dare everything, to the keen, honest enjoyment of the moment, which is seldom shown so fearlessly and instantaneously, except by children. Margaret liked the smile. It was the first thing she had admired in this new friend of her father's, and the opposition of character, shown in all these details of appearance she had been just noticing, seemed to explain the attraction they evidently felt towards each other. She rearranged her mother's worsted work, and fell back into her own thoughts, as completely forgotten by Mr. Thornton as if she had not been in the room. So thoroughly was he occupied in explaining to Mr. Hale the magnificent power, yet delicate adjustment of the knight of the steam-hammer, which was recalling to Mr. Hale some of the wonderful stories of subservient genii in the Arabian Nights, one moment stretching from earth to sky and filling all the width of the horizon, at the next obediently compressed into a vase small enough to be borne in the hand of a child.
And this imagination of power, this practical realization of a gigantic thought, came out of one man's brain in our good town. That very man has it within him to mount, step by step, on each wonder he achieves to higher marvels still. And I'll be bound to say we have many among us who, if he were gone, could spring into the breach and carry on the war which compels, and shall compel, all material power to yield to science. Your boast reminds me of the old lines, "I've 100 captains in England," he said, "as good as ever was he." At her father's quotation, Margaret looked suddenly up with inquiring wonder in her eyes. How in the world had they got from cog-wheels to Chevy Chase? "It is no boast of mine," replied Mr. Thornton. "It is plain matter of fact. I won't deny that I am proud of belonging to a town, or perhaps I should rather say a district, the necessities of which gave birth to such grandeur of conception. I would rather be a man, toiling, suffering, nay, failing and successless here, than lead a dull, prosperous life in the old worn grooves of what you call a more aristocratic society down in the South, with their slow days of careless ease. One may be clogged with honey and unable to rise and fly." "You are mistaken," said Margaret, roused by the aspersion on her beloved South to a fond vehemence of defence that brought the colour into her cheeks and the angry tears into her eyes. "You do not know anything about the South. If there is less adventure or less progress, I suppose I must not say less excitement, from the gambling spirit of trade, which seems requisite to force out these wonderful inventions, there is less suffering also. I see some men here going about in the streets who look ground down by some pinching sorrow or care, who are not only sufferers but haters. Now, in the South we have our poor, but there is not that terrible expression in their countenances of a sullen sense of injustice which I see here. You do not know the South, Mr. Thornton," she concluded, collapsing into a determined silence, and angry with herself for having said so much. "And may I say you do not know the North?" asked he, with an inexpressible gentleness in his tone, as he saw that he had really hurt her. She continued resolutely silent, yearning after the lovely haunts that she had left far away in Hampshire, with a passionate longing that made her feel her voice would be unsteady and trembling if she spoke. "At any rate, Mr. Thornton," said Mrs. Hale, "you will allow that Milton is much more smoky, dirty town than you will ever meet with in the South." "I'm afraid we must give up its cleanliness," said Mr. Thornton, with a quick gleaming smile. "But we are bidden by Parliament to burn our own smoke, so I suppose, like good little children, we shall do as we are bid, sometime." "But I think you told me you had altered your chimney so as to consume the smoke, did you not?" asked Mr. Hale. "Mine were altered by my own mill, before Parliament meddled with the affair. It was an immediate outlay, but it repaid me in the saving of coal. I am not sure whether I should have done it if I had waited until the Act was passed. At any rate, I should have waited to be informed against and fined, and given all the trouble in yielding that I legally could. But all laws which depend for their enforcement upon informers and fines become inert from the odiousness of the machinery. I doubt if there has been a chimney in Milton informed against for 5 years past, although some are constantly sending out 1/3 of their coal in what is called here unparliamentary smoke."
"I only know it is impossible to keep the muslin blinds clean here above a week together, and at Helston we have had them for a month or more, and they have not looked dirty at the end of that time. As for hands, Margaret, how many times did you say you had washed your hands this morning before 12 o'clock? 3 times, was it not?"
"Yes, mamma." "You seem to have a strong objection to Acts of Parliament and all legislation affecting your mode of management down here at Milton," said Mr. Hale. "Yes, I have, and many others have as well, and with justice, I think. The whole machinery, I don't mean the wood and iron machinery now, of the cotton trade is so new that it is no wonder if it does not work well in every part all at once. 70 years ago, what was it? And now, what is it not? Raw, crude materials came together. Men of the same level, as regarded education and station, took suddenly the different positions of masters and men, owing to the mother wit, as regarded opportunities and probabilities, which distinguished some, and made them far-seeing as to what great future lay concealed in that rude model of Sir Richard Arkwright's. The rapid development of what might be called a new trade gave those early masters enormous power of wealth and command. I don't mean merely over the workmen, I mean over purchasers, over the whole world's market. Why, I may give you, as an instance, an advertisement, inserted not 50 years ago in Milton, that so-and-so, one of the 6 calico printers of the time, would close his warehouse at noon each day, therefore that all purchasers must come before that hour. Fancy a man dictating in this manner the time which he would sell, and when he would not sell. Now, I believe, if a good customer chose to come at midnight, I should get up, and stand hat in hand to receive his orders."
Margaret's lip curled, but somehow she was compelled to listen. She could no longer abstract herself in her own thoughts.
"I only name such things to show what almost unlimited power the manufacturers had about the beginning of this century. The men were rendered dizzy by it. Because a man was successful in his ventures, there was no reason that in all other things his mind should be well balanced. On the contrary, his sense of justice and his simplicity were often utterly smothered under the glut of wealth that came down upon him. And they tell strange tales of the wild extravagance of living indulged in on gala days by those early cotton lords. There can be no doubt, too, of the tyranny they exercised over their work people. You know the proverb, Mr. Hale, 'Set a beggar on horseback, and he'll ride to the devil.' Well, some of these early manufacturers did ride to the devil in a magnificent style, crushing human bone and flesh under their horses' hoofs without remorse. By and by came a reaction. There were more factories, more masters, more men were wanted. The power of masters and men became more evenly balanced. And now the battle is pretty fairly waged between us. We will hardly submit to the decision of an empire, much less to the difference of a meddler with only a smattering of the knowledge of the real facts of the case, even though that meddler be called a High Court of Parliament." "Is there necessary for calling it a battle between the two classes?" asked Mr. Hale. "I know from your issuing the term, it is one which gives a true idea of the real state of things to your mind." "It is true, and I believe it to be as much a necessity as that prudent wisdom and good conduct are always opposed to. And doing battle with ignorance and improvidence, it is one of the great beauties of our system, that a working man may raise himself into the power and position of a master by his own exertions and behaviour. That, in fact, every one who rules himself to decency and sobriety of conduct and attention to his duties comes over to our own ranks. It may not always be as a master, but as an overlooker, a cashier, a bookkeeper, a clerk, one on the side of authority and order."
"You consider all who are unsuccessful in raising themselves in the world, from whatever cause, as your enemies, then, if I understand you rightly," said Margaret in a clear, cold voice.
"As their own enemies, certainly," said he quickly, not a little piqued by the haughty disapproval her form of expression and tone of speaking implied. But in a moment his straightforward honesty made him feel that his words were but a poor and quibbling answer to what she had said. And, be she as scornful as she liked, it was a duty he owed himself to explain, as truly as he could, what he did mean. Yet it was very difficult to separate her interpretation and keep it distinct from his meaning. He could best have illustrated what he wanted to say by telling them something of his own life, but it was not too personal a subject to speak about to strangers. Still, it was the simple, straightforward way of explaining his meaning. So, putting aside the touch of shyness that brought a momentary flush of colour into his dark cheek, he said, "I am not speaking without book. 16 years ago my father died under very miserable circumstances. I was taken from school, and had to become a man, as well as I could, in a few days. I had such a mother as few are blessed with, a woman of strong power and firm resolve. We went into a small country town, where living was cheaper than in Milton, and where I got employment in a draper's shop, a capital place, by the way, for obtaining a knowledge of goods. Week by week our income came to 15 shillings, out of which 3 people had to be kept. My mother managed so that I put by 3 out of these 15 shillings regularly. This made the beginning. This taught me self-denial. Now that I am able to afford my mother such comforts as her age, rather than her own wish, requires, I thank her silently on each occasion for the early training she gave me. Now, when I feel that in my own case it is no good luck, nor merit, nor talent, but simply the habits of life which taught me to despise indulgences not thoroughly earned, indeed, never to think twice about them, I believe that this suffering, which Miss Hale says is impressed on the countenances of the people of Milton, is but the natural punishment of dishonestly enjoyed pleasure, at some former period in their lives. I do not look on self-indulgent, sensual people as worthy of my hatred. I simply look upon them with contempt for their poorness of character. "But you have had the rudiments of a good education," remarked Mr. Hale. "The quick zest with which you are now reading Homer shows me that you do not come to it as an unknown book. You have read it before, and are only recalling your old knowledge." "That is true. I had blundered along it at school. I dare say I was even considered a pretty fair classic in those days, though my Latin and Greek have slipped away from me since. But I ask you, what preparation they were for such a life as I have had to lead? None at all. Utterly none at all. On the point of education, any man who can read and write starts fair with me in the amount of really useful knowledge that I had at the time." "Well, I don't agree with you. But there I am perhaps somewhat of a pedant. Did not the recollection of the heroic simplicity of the Homeric life nerve you up?" "Not one bit," exclaimed Mr. Thornton, laughing. "I was too busy to think about any dead people, with the living pressing alongside of me, neck to neck, in the struggle for bread. Now that I have my mother safe in the quiet peace that becomes her age, and duly rewards her former exertions, I can turn to all that old narration, and thoroughly enjoy it." "I dare say my remark came from the professional feeling of there being nothing like leather," replied Mr. Hale. When Mr. Thornton rose up to go away, after shaking hands with Mr. and Mrs. Hale, he made an advance to Margaret to wish her good-bye in a similar manner. It was the frank, familiar custom of the place, but Margaret was not prepared for it. She simply bowed her farewell, although the instant she saw the hand half put out, quickly drawn back, she was sorry she had not been aware of the intention. Mr. Thornton, however, knew nothing of her sorrow, and, drawing himself up to his full height, walked off, muttering as he left the house, "A more proud, disagreeable girl I never saw. Even her great beauty is blotted out of one's memory by her scornful ways."
End of chapter 10.